Yeah, that's interesting. I'm sure there'll be some questions come the panel. Pam, the floor is yours. Pam comes from a different background, a climate negotiation background, and has a lot of experience with COP. So it's wonderful to have Pam to share her views.
Yeah. So I'm coming up here a bit nervous. I've changed my slide because I wanted to give a real shout out to Richard Jones and also to the State of the Cryosphere report. We have taken the tradition of using photos from scientists, if we possibly can, on our cover. We're still looking for the 2023 cover. Why are we doing this? Because things in your field especially, but all throughout cryosphere, it's changing so quickly that we felt the need beginning in 2021 to put out annual reports just before COPs, summarizing the latest updates and then a lot of background material for those who are coming to this. Because a lot of negotiators will come into this from completely different things, okay? I'm nervous about this, and I'm wearing my power suit. It may have to come off. This is actually from the 1950s. It was my grandmother's. But I have decided to go ahead and be intentionally provocative, even though, especially during the first session, I was kind of like, oh, gee, they're not going to like this. But here goes. And this is bridging really all three, and I think it's appropriate that I'm in the middle session in some ways, because this is going to maybe show some of the messy and imperfect ways that your science is being used. And I'm going to also try to say, you know, where you can maybe help us as well as yourselves. ICCI, we work on primarily 5 aspects of the cryosphere that have policy relevance. And so that's why we focus on these particular 5. We include polar oceans, even though, as Georg Kaiser, a glaciologist, always, you know, grumps at me that water is not cryosphere because it's not frozen, but it doesn't get enough attention in the oceans community. The important thing about all of these, though, is that they all largely depend on peak temperature, or CO2, especially when we're looking at polar ocean acidification. All but Arctic sea ice are irreversible on human timescales, and all are well in train today, actually, well below 2 degrees C. But, and then this is where the more modern language comes in from AR6, they can be slowed or avoided, especially with very low emissions, the SSP1 scenario, which has a 1.6 peak and is below 1.5 in 2100. So what we've been doing is ICCI, and I would say especially since AR5, when some of the cryosphere scientists engaged in that came to us. And actually, Jochen showed one of my least favorite quotes from AR5 that was just phrased in a way that no policymaker in the world can understand it. Because they were switching from meters to centimeters to decimeters in the same sentence. That came from China, by the way. I shout out to very good Chinese negotiators, but it made it ununderstandable. So what we try to do is bring this into these policy forums. And when you're talking about constraining, okay, for the past, I would say 5 or 6 years, these are our top figures, okay? We're basing this on paleo data. And so when people talk about deep uncertainty, in many ways, from the point of view, and these are in particular from Julie Brigham-Greta, Andrea Dutton, big paleo people in the US, these are pretty well accepted in the paleo community. So the question for you in the room, right, is how fast is this going to happen? Is this going to take 10,000 years or 1,000 years? But this is where the Earth has been in the past. And I'm working also in a context where I'm paying a lot of attention to this. And it's the only number that matters. And a lot of people in the policy world will talk about emissions are leveling out, or, you know, that policies will lead us only to 2.7 or 2.1 or 1.9, depending on how you look at it. This is the only number that matters. We hit 424 with very little publicity. 2023 should be remembered as the year when CO2 levels hit 50% above pre-industrial. And there's been no pause, as was shown in the slide earlier, even with COVID. And so this is what's happening in reality. In the UNFCCC then, because I'm going to focus mostly on this as one example where, some of your work is used. Traditionally, it's been seen, and by many, it's simply seen as the canary in the coal mine. It's an early indicator. It's nothing that's going to have an impact on the rest of the world. AR5 and the SROC really began moving that forward a bit, but I would say many policymakers still see cryosphere as kind of a sidebar issue. But because of your science, cryosphere is beginning to shift from a local issue for, say, if you live in the Arctic, or if you work in Antarctica, or if you live in a mountain region, to something that will have a global impact that is irreversible, again, on human timescales, but a lot of this can be prevented with urgent emissions reductions. So cryosphere and the Paris Agreement, that's my slide. Not mentioned, 0. Cryosphere decision points in response to the SROC then in 2019 in Madrid. There were decision points on oceans. There was a decision point on lands. There were dialogues that took place because of these two decision points, one on oceans and one on lands. The covered decision was completely silent on cryosphere. And as a matter of fact, over and over again at that COP, we kept on hearing negotiators refer to the special report on oceans. And that was where they stopped. And you can joke that they couldn't pronounce cryosphere or something, but regardless, it became very evident that we needed to push forward on cryosphere. So what I call decision text remediation, because in diplomacy, if it isn't mentioned, it isn't there. We got it included in the preamble with a lot of support from 7 countries, actually, that kept on trying to raise this. Now, a legal person will tell you that that is worth absolutely nothing. Preambular language can include absolutely anything. It doesn't have any real force. In COP27, we got this included in what's called the operational language, down below the preamble. Recognizes, and Valerie, I think, showed this earlier, the impact of climate change on the cryosphere, the need for further understanding of these impacts, including of tipping points. By the way, ICCI, we try to use thresholds, not tipping points, but I think tipping points is winning the day. It's just too, evocative. It was included in other decision point tracks. And then also at COP27, we moved towards a new grouping of countries called Ambition on Melting Ice. So this was 20 countries that signed a declaration that really raised these issues from the point of view of their impacts. So it's not just mountain and polar countries. We have Vanuatu, we have Samoa, we have Senegal, we have Liberia. We have Tanzania with its, few almost glaciers in the Rwenzori. And these 20 ministers got a 6.5-minute presentation that went through these 5 dynamics, galloped through them, couldn't give a lot of information, but it was enough that these ministers then went from this declaration, which was late in the second week, to a lot of pushback from Egypt, in particular as the COP president, to re-emphasize 2 degrees and go back on the Glasgow Pact language. And in these closed sessions, we were told that the ministers who heard this presentation were using the science as an argument to stick with the Glasgow language. And we're moving then towards, in terms of 2023, and even this week has been some developments. Because of that language, that operational language, we were able to hold a full-day informal workshop. It wasn't official UNFCCC, but still. That was the first focus meeting in that way on cryosphere dynamics. And so about 40 countries ended up attending, and then they started using that in the subsequent negotiations. So this is, again, where a lot of the sausage is made, not at the COPs, but at these bond meetings that take place every year in June. And a lot of countries were raising it for the first time. A lot of this is going on in what's called the global stock take, and I'm trying to avoid, too much nerdy diplomatic stuff here. But the stock take is in the Paris Agreement. It's mandated every 5 years. Countries, parties are supposed to come together and take stock as to are we, being successful in terms of meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. And this is the first one, so it sort of sets a precedent for what's going to come in the future. So a lot of countries raised it. I shout out especially the bold ones here. The technical synthesis dropped a little under a week ago on Friday. It did not mention these issues except in one way, which is, yeah, we have these irreversible processes and tipping points, and we really need to understand them for the next stock take. In other words, it won't be taken into account until 5 years. There's going to be some strategizing over the next couple of days because, again, things have been very compressed, and the submissions, as they're called, in response to the report that dropped a week ago, are due tomorrow. And so, actually, during part of this conference, some of the scientists are going to be taking part in a meeting with the negotiators to answer questions so that they can bring this into their own submissions. And next week, then, during the Climate Ambition Summit, the AMI countries, some of them, maybe not all, are going to be starting a move towards, in essence, going to COP28 and requesting in the cover decision not just an emphasis on 1.5, but an exclusive emphasis on 1.5, saying because of what we now understand about cryosphere that was less well understood in 2015, 2 degrees needs to be off the table. 2 degrees is too high, which is a heavy lift, and frankly, it probably won't succeed, but hopefully it will get the idea out there that we're really on the edge because of cryosphere. So I'm going to shift a little bit about different ways for you to reach policymakers through papers, and then go into some of my more the tomato dodging things that I warned about at the beginning. Obviously, highlight what's directly policy relevant, directly reference the policy processes if you can, and connect findings, if you can, to projections. Like temperature is great. Obviously, anyone deeply involved in negotiations is going to understand what an SSP is, but if you can use temperature levels in your modeling, that is much, much better. And I put some great examples here, Park et al., Stokes et al., and DeCanto et al. From the past 3 years. Tell enough about methods just to make sure that you know what you're talking about, but don't go into the real details because you'll lose them at that point. Speak to local relevance. I'm going to show some examples about how you can use figures that are more eligible to non-specialists. Uncertainty. Okay, for me, this is always the elephant in the room, and maybe especially when it comes to Antarctica, more so than any of the other cryosphere dynamics, except maybe permafrost emissions. Think hard about how the word uncertainty is used by your audience. Think about using the word risk instead, for example. Sandwich it if you want to talk about uncertainty. If you lead with the word uncertainty, they're going to not listen to the rest of what you say because they're going to say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. If you end with uncertainty, they're going to discount everything you've said before. So put it in the middle and then sandwich it between other kinds of messages. Also, and this is, I know that people need funding, but if you overuse with policymakers, say the European Commission, then great uncertainty or deep uncertainty, that gets translated to the policy world again. Yeah, we need to actually work on this before we can make any decision. And that's sort of what happened with that GST decision. Because of course people are talking about uncertainty, but I know for a fact that the cryosphere scientists who were participating in these technical discussions, they didn't mean to convey that, but that was the takeaway. So just think about that. And your work really is essential. Do keep that in mind. I hope you feel it's meaningful because it really, really is, and it's used. And I would really encourage people to consider IPCC work because even though we're really trying to do things, say, with the State of the Cryosphere report, as Jochen said earlier, if it's not IPCC, for a lot of countries, it doesn't exist. And so that really is the gold standard in terms of policy. This is one example of something we've done from the glacier world, okay? When this study first came out by Ben Marzion, he was showing, like most of you probably do, sea level equivalent. And then the graphs go up. And policymakers don't understand why, because the glacier is shrinking, the graph is going up. And so we simply got permission from Ben to flip the graphs. Easy thing. Now they can understand it. And this is among the most compelling figures we've ever used, by the way, because if you look at this low RCP 2.6 emissions scenario, especially in the Alps, you can see that there's a big difference, and you even see a little bit of regrowth by 2300. This is another thing that came out last year. This is the Great Aletsch Glacier. And as this animation runs through, I'm not going to use a lot of time, but you can see that two really important messages that maybe could come from your community as well is that through 2060, there's no difference between those two. We've got that much heat built into this particular glacier system. It's the highest glacier, the largest glacier in Europe. But then by the end of the run in 2100, there's a huge difference. And so it both illustrates that we've done a lot of damage already, but we can prevent there from being even more damage. That's why I like this. So here are some choices that we're using, and Jochen actually referred to this. This is how we're trying to make the sausage as ICCI. And this is where I think I'm going to raise some objections, but stay with me. Let me know what you think either afterwards. Don't hit me. But we're using maps based on that dotted line and post-AR6 research right now very actively for a lot of governments. And the time frames are based on just drawing out the lines that are in these scenarios. It doesn't take into account storm surges or high tides either, but we're simply showing countries the implications of their choices. And I will say that another small island developing state, after we were asked to present to them, said, I've been working in adaptation for 20 years. Why is no one telling me this? We talked about the uncertainties, but we said this is what this part of the research world is pointing to. So, famous dotted line, right? Based on the low likelihood we explained to negotiators, which finally got into low likelihood means 2 studies, right? Bamber et al. 2020, DeCanto et al. 2021. Dotted line, but the IPCC felt it was important enough, and maybe people like Valerie fighting enough to get it in there, that it was included, and that was important. And then what we say is there's a growing body of research since AR6 closed on January 31st, 2021, that is pointing to that dotted line. And this is one example. This is Park et al., which you can also refer to, but there's also Stokes et al., again from 2020, and then others that are just continually coming out pointing to that dotted line as certainly more than just 2 studies at this point. And this is especially because this study looked at both Greenland and Antarctica together, which made it rather unique. And yes, it's complicated, but one of the most important take-homes we're giving people, again, trying also to come from this paleo world, if you look at SSP2, which is a peak of 1.8 degrees, that little purple line is still going up very, very slowly. Well, that tracks with paleo, right? A 1.8 degree world, that's probably what you'd be seeing. The question is, does it reflect a tipping point? And we don't know that because this ends in 2150. So does that then start going down again because SSP2 peaks at 1.8 and is close to 1.5 at the end of this century? But the only safe level is SSP1, which peaks at 1.6 and by the end of the century is at or below 1.5. And that's the only straight line we've got here. So then we just show this. Okay, and this is what is possible in terms of choices. 1 meter, I think we would say it's probably, again, this is ICCI, I would say it's probably inevitable at this point just because of warming built into the system, but maybe by the mid-2300s, but we could have this by 2070 with continued current emissions. And again, we're following high emissions right now, just looking at CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is 3. Could happen by the early 2100s. I was interested to hear that NASA has now taken down, 3 to 2. We're still using 3, but by early 2100s as opposed to 2100. This could be by the early 2200s. Again, this is primarily based on DeCanto et al., but we're looking at 6 meters in the Nile Delta, and this is 10 meters. And again, this particular tool, by the way, which is Climate Central, they stop at 10. So we can't show, the 15 ruled out, but 10 is bad enough. I don't think we need to go beyond that. This is Nassau. This is just 1 meter, and this is 3 meters. So Bahamas is gone, if anyone has ever vacationed there, if we continue doing what we're doing. And of course, I just made these last night. This is a very usable tool. So this is the Gulf of Venice. You heard a lot about this earlier. This is potentially by the early 2100s. This gives a little bit of a zoom out. And then here, looking at to Padua, actually, if we get to the point of 10 meters. So I talked about myself as a recovering diplomat. So if you guys are recovering Antarctic researchers, if I, again, want to be really provocative, connect Antarctica to impacts. Valerie mentioned, for example, that in Working Group 3, Antarctica really isn't mentioned, but it should be. And in the oceans community, they talk about sea level rise, but they don't talk about Antarctica. We need to be connecting Antarctica to the impacts. Don't be afraid to be called alarmist if your results are alarming. That's a really good way to shut down a researcher or, a civil society person. Oh, you're alarmist. There was a researcher, a French researcher, who was actually asked to speak to the French Parliament. She got that question, and she said, well, my results are alarming. I'm not alarmist. This is what the science says. She was talking about mountain glaciers. Don't soft pedal results because they're too scary. I think we have an obligation to be honest to people about our results, even if they're scary. At the end, I'm going to say ways that you can make it less scary by simply saying we're choosing to do this. This isn't inevitable. Emphasize agency. Future emissions determine these futures. And bottom line, and with apologies to everyone in the room in terms of the different groups here, are you going to use more globally based climate models or models based on paleo or models based on recent? Don't let those disputes lead to such a perception of uncertainty that it leads to policymakers thinking that what we're doing is okay, because it might be okay. All right, now if you think that, that's fine. But just think about how your work is going to be used and how those disputes might be used, and make sure to bridge them when you're talking to the policy world. So good news, bad news, which is important. 2 minutes? One, okay. That a lot of nations will be impacted sooner with more loss and damage if today's emissions continue, but very low emissions can mitigate that. Because of this new and growing body of knowledge, 2 degrees is probably too high to be considered consistent with what's called the Framework Convention. That's the basis of Paris and everything else. Article 2, avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. We're going to exceed 1.5 under all emission scenarios right now, but that period will be very brief under very low emissions. That's a good news. Very low emissions will have a discernible signal, according to the IPCC, in some areas already around 2040, and that's even avoiding things like lower air pollution that people will be able to see. Continue high emissions are going to push us beyond the limits of adaptation. Need to be clear on that. And IPCC is saying, and these very low and low emissions scenarios, they're fully feasible. Economically, technologically, it's an issue of political will. The political will is not there. And this is pretty much how I end. It's a bit of a push at Dubai, but the site is right at the line of 10 meters, cut straight across where the COP is going to take place. So really, thank you all for your work. I'm happy to talk to people afterwards. Our Antarctica director couldn't be here. Some of you may know her, Lydie Melescar-Montier. She's worked a lot on some of the communications, actually, that Valerie showed. And what you do is important. Keep doing it. So thank you.